A fresh warning is rippling across West Asia as Yemen's Ansar Allah movement signals it is prepared to open a wider front if the conflict around Iran escalates again. In a statement that underscored how quickly this war could expand beyond its current flashpoints, the group's foreign ministry said it would enter the fighting with full force if the United States and Israel resume what it described as aggression against Iran and the axis of resistance. The message landed at a moment of heightened tension around one of the world's most sensitive maritime choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. The new escalation has been driven by an announcement from U.S. President Donald Trump that American naval forces have begun enforcing what his administration describes as a sweeping blockade connected to Iranian maritime activity. The move comes after a long, high-stakes round of U.S.-Iran negotiations in Islamabad ended without a breakthrough, and as a fragile ceasefire clock continues to run. The warning from Yemen was not framed as a distant political gesture. It was presented as a readiness to act militarily if the war widens. And it leaned heavily on a core argument the Houthis have repeated for years, that pressure campaigns do not contain conflict, they spread it. The group cautioned that any escalation at sea would not remain limited to warships and missiles. It would spill into global commerce, energy markets, shipping insurance, and the cost of goods far from the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway. It is a global economic artery, and even a perceived threat can send tremors through oil and gas markets within hours. In its statement, the Yemeni side cast Trump's focus on moving the confrontation to the sea as an admission that earlier pressure had failed. The claim was blunt. The United States and Israel, it argued, had already tried to weaken Iran through force, and it did not produce the outcome they wanted. The ministry referenced EA. Real rounds of fighting and framed Iran's endurance as proof that escalation only hardens resistance and widens the battlefield. That framing matters because it explains the Houthis' current logic. If the contest is moving toward the sea, then they believe they already operate effectively in that arena, and they are prepared to expand operations. Trump's language in recent public messaging has been similarly stark. In a post on Truth Social, he said American forces would begin blockading ships entering or leaving the Strait of Hormuz and would start clearing what he called Iranian mines. The message was meant to project maximum deterrence. He signaled military readiness and demanded that Iran end what he described as the crisis. But Tehran's response has been defiant. Iranian Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf rejected the premise that threats would force Iran into submission, in a statement reflecting the tone hardening across Iran's political establishment during this war. He said threats would not work with Iran. He also reinforced a warning Iran has repeated throughout the conflict. He said Iran would respond to force with force. At the same time, he tried to keep a diplomatic door visibly open, adding that Iran remained prepared for dialogue, but only on terms that include mutual respect. That combination, defiance paired with conditional openness, has been a consistent theme as Iran tries to avoid looking weak domestically while keeping international diplomatic channels alive. Those channels were tested in Islamabad, where U.S. and Iranian delegations held marathon talks that stretched past 20 hours, with mediators trying to turn a ceasefire into something more durable. The talks did not resolve the core disputes, but they did reveal how both sides are positioning themselves. From the Houthi perspective, the very act of Washington sitting down for direct talks is being portrayed as a political victory for Tehran. Their argument is that the United States, after applying military pressure, is now trying to win through negotiation what it could not secure through bombardment and coercion. The Houthis framed the talks as proof that Iran cannot be broken by force, and that the war, instead of collapsing Iran, is dragging the wider region closer to ignition. The Islamabad negotiations, however, ended without bridging key differences. The absence of an agreement has increased the risk that the ceasefire collapses or becomes a pause before a more dangerous phase. That is the context in which Trump's blockade announcement is being read across the region, not as a standalone maritime decision, but as a signal that the U.S. is prepared to press Iran harder, even while diplomacy remains unresolved. Against this backdrop, Yemen's leadership has also issued separate political warnings aimed directly at Arab capitals. Mahdi al-Mashat, who leads the Supreme Political Council in Sana'a, reaffirmed what he described as unwavable, earring solidarity with Tehran. He framed the conflict not as an isolated U.S.-Iran confrontation, but as part of a coordinated regional project that would reshape power across the Middle East. His warning was framed as a choice presented to Arab and Islamic states: do not assist what Yemen describes as a conspiracy or risk being seen as participants in the war. In one of the most pointed lines attributed to him, he said, if they cannot help defeat a Zionist conspiracy, they must not assist in implementing it. Asterisk, it was a message aimed at governments that might offer logistics, airspace access, intelligence cooperation, or quiet political support for a broader U.S. Israeli campaign. That kind of messaging is designed to raise the political cost of neutrality or of silent cooperation, and it reflects a reality that has become more pronounced as the war has grown. Even countries not firing a shot can still become entangled through basing agreements, surveillance support, or maritime sea. A warred nation, Yemen's Ansar Allah movement also used the moment to praise Iran's retaliation and frame Iran's response as defensive and regionally significant. In their telling, attacks on Iran are not simply about Iran. They are about the balance of power in the Middle East, and specifically about preventing Israel from gaining what the group calls unchecked control across the region. That framing is central to how the Houthis seek legitimacy beyond Yemen. By presenting Iran's struggle as a defense of the region and of broader Islamic interests, they tie their own actions, past and future, to a narrative larger than national borders. The war itself, as described in regional discourse, has been unfolding for weeks, with exchanges of strikes and counterstrikes expanding the target list and widening the arc of risk. Reports across multiple outlets have described Israeli-linked sites and U.S. military assets across the region coming under repeated attack. The tempo of missile and drone activity and the steady stream of warnings from armed groups aligned with Iran have reinforced a grim conclusion shared by many analysts. The conflict is no longer contained, and the remaining guardrails are fragile. For Yemen, that fragility matters because the Houthis have already demonstrated the ability to disrupt maritime traffic. In the Red Sea and nearby waters, their operations in previous phases of regional conflict affected commercial routes, forced shipping companies to reroute, and raised global shipping costs. That history is why their latest threat carries weight even for audiences outside the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is different from the Red Sea in geography and security posture, but it is even more consequential economically. A significant portion of the world's traded oil and liquefied natural gas moves through that narrow corridor. Any sustained disruption, whether through mines, missile attacks, seizures, or a blockade, can jolt energy prices globally and feed inflation. This is why officials and analysts have warned that escalation at Hormuz could rapidly transform a regional confrontation into a worldwide economic shock. It would not only affect fuel prices, but also shipping insurance, delivery timelines, and the cost of consumer goods that depend on stable maritime trade. Yemen's warning is also designed to deter what it sees as a new maritime phase of confrontation. The Houthis are arguing that moving the conflict to the sea is not a contained tactic. It is a multiplier. A blockade posture, mine-clearing operations, ship interdictions, and the risk of miscalculation around crowded sea lanes can produce incidents that spiral quickly, even if no party intends a broader war. That risk is amplified by the speed at which information and misinformation travels during crises. A single reported explosion, a mistaken identification of a vessel, or an allegation of mining can prompt immediate retaliation, particularly when leaders are publicly committed to projecting strength. Trump's stance has been framed publicly in terms of enforcement and deterrence. Iran's posture has been framed in terms of sovereignty and resistance. Yemen's posture is being framed as conditional intervention. If Iran is hit again, Yemen will not stay on the sidelines. The convergence of those positions is what makes the moment dangerous. The diplomatic track for now remains alive but shaky. Mediators have been trying to keep channels open after the Islamabad talks ended without a deal, but the gap between what Washington demands and what Tehran will accept remains wide. Even when dialogue continues, it is happening under the shadow of military movements and threats that can make compromise politically toxic for both sides. Iran's leadership has insisted it will not negotiate under coercion. U.S. leadership has signaled it will escalate pressure if Iran does not bend. And armed groups aligned with Iran from Yemen to other parts of the reg have positioned themselves as active participants rather than spectators. What is emerging is a layered conflict, state-to-state confrontation, proxy and partner actions, maritime pressure, and economic warfare all running simultaneously. That complexity makes resolution harder, not easier, because each layer has its own triggers and its own actors who may calculate risk differently. For Arab governments, Yemen's warning raises another uncomfortable reality. Even staying out of the fight can become politically and strategically difficult if the conflict broadens. If maritime trade is disrupted, regional economies suffer. If bases are used for operations, those countries become targets for retaliation. If they attempt mediation, they may be accused by one side of bias. And for the global economy, the risk is not abstract. The Strait of Hormuz is a place where geopolitics and daily life collide. A rise in shipping disruption can mean higher fuel costs within days and higher price. excess on everything from food to manufactured goods within weeks. That is why the latest statements from Yemen are not just rhetoric in a distant conflict. They are signals in a wider system, one that connects missiles and mines to markets and mortgages. The central question now is whether the maritime escalation becomes a pressure tactic that remains short of a shooting war at sea, or whether it becomes the spark for a broader confrontation involving more actors and more fronts. Yemen's message suggests it is preparing for the second scenario. And as this war inches closer to the world's most critical shipping lanes, the margin for error continues to shrink.